Turns out you've been training glutes wrong the entire time, but that's okay because America here is going to show us how. Is your name really America?
Yes.
Now, my assumption was before I did all the testing that sumo deadlifts would get the highest glute activation. Because every time I did them, my glutes were on fire, I was sore for days, but it turns out I was wrong. Kind of. If we look at a model of your actual glute muscle and look at their origin and insertion, you're going to see as you externally rotate your hips, God, this is a piece of shit. How do I reach these kids? Perfect. When you externally rotate your hip, i.e. walk your feet wider, you're actually shortening your glute max before the lift even starts. It's not a bad thing, but it's not optimal. To figure out how to properly work glute max, we need to look at fiber orientation and function. Because if you look at the orientation of the fibers, you can see the natural path to lengthen the muscle is staying perfectly in the sagittal plane directly out in front of you. And since its primary function is to extend the hip, aka dry hump, then it's fairly clear what we need to do to make every glute exercise even better. Walking lunges, for example, are a great glute max exercise because you're staying in that sagittal plane, it's directly out in front of you, and as long as you're not a lazy piece of shit and step your feet together the entire time, you're gonna get full hip extension. But we can make it even better by exaggerating the movement by leaning forward with each rep at the very bottom, which is going to lengthen that muscle even more. And this obviously applies to similar movements like step-ups, where as you lean forward, you're increasing the range of motion that glute has to work through. Another great example of an exercise that takes full advantage of fiber orientation are glute-focused hyperextensions, because your glutes are actually what are pulling you through the sagittal plane. Now, does that mean these are the absolute best glute exercises? No. They're great, but the goal of hypertrophy should always be to isolate down to the muscle as much as humanly possible. With these, there's too many secondary muscles that could easily jump in and become the prime mover if you simply just misjudge the length of your stride. Too short quads, too long hamstrings. These fall into the let's make sure we ruin our weekend because we're unable to walk category that you throw in at the end of your workout. If you're somebody that has one sorry ass of an ass and it looks like 2 Ziploc bags of Thanksgiving gravy has been stapled to your back, and when you fart it doesn't even make a noise, then you should be doing movements that allow you to more effectively isolate your glutes, like an assisted reverse lunge. And you may think assisted means easier. It does not. Ask your grandma how great her fucking life is and how much she loves assistance. The reason the assisted version is better in terms of isolation is because you're taking some of the emphasis off that knee joint and shifting it towards your hip. And you actually shift your weight as you're doing it to get more tension on the hip itself, but you're also increasing that range of motion by leaning forward as well. Another great example of this is the TRX version, because again, you're in that sagittal plane, but you can really exaggerate the stretch because you can force yourself back during the negative and pull yourself up with your glutes. Now, does that mean that all your training should be centered around bodyweight exercises that you can really control and isolate? No. Stop asking dumb questions. Even though they've cut a few dead asses open and found that your glute max fibers are anywhere from 52 to 68% type 1 fibers, making the case that they would respond better to higher rep training. But there's a couple problems with those studies. For one, we know that fiber types can transition. A competitive runner is going to have a completely different ass than a competitive powerlifter. Second being, if you look at the case studies where they actually cut open these cadavers, they're kind of ridiculous. The one that determined your glute max was 52% type 1 fibers was done on 6 males, all of which being an average weight of 170 pounds. I'm sure they were adorable little men with ass cheeks like 2 little legs, but that's not us. And the other study that determined that 68% of glute max fibers were type 1, I'll just read you the title. Selective type 2 fiber muscular atrophy in patients with osteoarthritis of the hip. Why the fuck would that matter to me? Just from an anecdotal standpoint, look at this ass. It's a 9 times powerlifting state record holder, and it didn't come from throwing on a glute band and walking side to side. It came from lifting heavy ass weight. Lifting heavy weight should be a part of your program. The best way to do that is with a hip thrust. It's phenomenal at overloading those glutes, but even more important than that, it's incredible for isolating them as well. When I use the EMG device to test hip thrusts, I found it's less about trying to tweak the form to make it even more optimal because they're just innately that good. As long as you don't turn your toes out, which is going to bring in your biceps femoris, or walk your feet out too far, which brings your semitendinosus and membranosus and the 2 other hamstring muscles, whatever the fuck they're called. Next up, let's talk about the redheaded stepchild of all glute muscles, the glute med. Wait a minute, do you have gingivitis? Okay, I have to use this stupid model to explain this because the swimsuit doesn't have a glute med on it. Your glute med has anterior, lateral, and posterior fibers. Your anterior fibers help internally rotate the hip, posterior externally rotate, but when they all work in conjunction, they do one hell of a job at abducting the hip. So if we look at what happens when you're sitting in this position doing abduction, you're actually shortening the anterior fibers of your glute med, and then at the same time lengthening those posterior fibers. So In reality, you're only working half the fucking muscle. The only way to get all those fibers working in conjunction with each other on a machine like this is actually leaning back and forcing your hips up. And I know, you hated doing this thing before. Now you gotta force your hips up and have your little chode sticking out. It's only a matter of time before somebody walks by and flicks it. Which brings us back to the original exercise, sumo deadlifts. Now, they're not phenomenal for the glute max, but they are phenomenal for the glute med as long as you're doing with a hip hinge focus. If you do them more straight up and down like this, you end up getting more quad activation, specifically VMO. It's still mostly glute med, but it's a lot of quad for my liking. But when you hinge at your hips, you're able to limit the amount of activation that comes from your quads and make it just a completely strict glute med exercise, better than any dumb abductor machine. And yes, this will all be implemented in the new program, which is live, hence the reason I had a giant blue ass in the thumbnail. Also, she left her chalk, so that'll also be for sale. It smells like Christmas.